Folks, we are truly honored to have John Gasaway, college hoops analyst for ESPN Insider, joining us today on the Screen the Screener podcast. John is an incredible basketball mind. Gus and I have followed him now for years. Love reading his thoughts on all things college basketball. He's written for Basketball Prospectus. He's written for the Wall Street Journal. He has his own blog, johngasaway.com, where he produces some great work, especially one of our favorites, which is Tuesday Truths, where he analyzes how well the 120 teams in the nation's top 10 conferences are doing against their league opponents on a per-possession basis. So you can find him on Twitter at John Gasaway, Gasaway, and he loves college basketball. He's a numbers guy. We love numbers. John, it's an honor to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for a few minutes.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, John, both my partner Gus and I have been huge fan of yours for quite some time, but I think we have to start this interview back on the December 22nd article. You published an article then talking about the 6 remaining undefeated teams. At the time, they were Villanova, UCLA, Baylor, Gonzaga, Creighton, and USC. You then predicted when each team was going to lose, and you were correct on 5 out of 6. I'm going to give you 5.5 because you did predict that Gonzaga would lose to BYU. It was just on the road and they lost last night. So, John, we got to start there. That must have been a great feeling, no?
And that was totally my editor's fault. I definitely said Gonzaga would lose at home to BYU. I would never in a million years predict they would lose on the road instead, because everybody knows that BYU would lose by 13 at San Diego, but beat the perfect unbeaten Gonzaga team, no problem. No, that was a good run, and they don't often line up like that. But as each one came to happen, I thought, wow, maybe something is cooking here. And then for this seems like ancient history now, but Gonzaga actually went to BYU and won rather easily, and I stupidly thought, well, that means this team's going unbeaten all the way to the round of 32 at a minimum. But that's that's the great thing about this sport is Gonzaga goes 3 of 16 on their threes, and BYU makes just enough shots in Spokane to win. What a great way to set the table for the tournament, because that's exactly what you'll see in the brackets is you've got this team every bit as good as Gonzaga, and they just leave the slightest little opening for a decent, but by no means, a legendary opponent. And bam, I mean, that's enough on any given day. So good preparation for the tournament should be a fun time.
No, it definitely should be. And it's funny, I had liked Baylor all year long. So my partner had reminded me when you predicted the loss at West Virginia, we did a whole skit on it. I was positive they were going to go in and win. They got their doors blown off. So the curse of John Gasaway, we're going to call it from here on out. So
yeah, that was a rare instance where it really wasn't even close.
No.
I remember that game, and I was like literally sitting down. I just had my popcorn already.
Yeah.
It was over after about 7 minutes. I was like, wait a minute, I've got 2 hours blocked out for this. So that was not a particularly tense matchup on that one.
We do some picks against the spread, and my partner is right now. He only puts a couple out, so he holds back and he uses all these metrics. One, of course, is yours, which is fantastic. And I remember that point spread, which was somehow Baylor, undefeated, number 1 in the country, was an underdog by 7. So when I saw that, I said, John's tied into something here, but my stubbornness refused to give in. But about, midway through the first half, it was done. Let's go to Gonzaga. So they lose at home last night to BYU, 79-71. I think the general opinion has been, listen, we've seen this before, right? 2013, they were number 1 seed. They struggled in the first round against Southern, 64-58, and then they lost, of course, to Wichita State, who made the Final Four that year. 2015, they received a 2 seed. They had a decently close game with North Dakota State. Then they beat Iowa, UCLA, and they lost to Duke in the Elite Eight. But for those that have watched the team, which I know you have, I think they look different this year. My partner certainly does. He picked them to the Final Four. Better scoring, better chemistry, balance. You've written about this in your Tuesday Truth last week. After that loss, though, are you still bullish on Gonzaga's Final Four chances?
Well, it's not so much that I'm bullish on Gonzaga, is that I'm the bearishness that some people feel toward the Zags, I feel like we should visit that upon every contender because every team is doomed after all, except for one. So absolutely, Gonzaga can lose at home to BYU. Kansas is going to be a 1 seed. There's a slight chance they could even be the overall number 1 seed. They lost at home to Iowa State. I mean, you can pick Villanova probably will be the overall number 1 seed. They lost at home to Butler. They got swept by Butler this year. There are no Kentucky 2015s. If that's your favored brew, you can look and not find it. Nobody is so big and scary that they can't get beat in 2017. So I share the skepticism about Gonzaga. I just feel like they're on the same plane as everybody else. And so that's a glass half full compliment, I think. They are just as good and just as vulnerable as these major conference teams that I mentioned. You're right. They do score well, particularly on the interior. Even last night, they were, no problem making their twos. And I think that will serve them well over the long haul. They are a dominant team, both offensively and defensively, inside the arc. Outside, just the same, just plain folks, as we saw last night. But Zach Collins is not talked up enough. He's a freshman who comes off the bench, a really good rim defender. And then Karnowski gets all the publicity. He's just a 2-point machine. Williams Goss does a good job getting to the rim. So, if you want to say this is a little better positioned as a team than they were in 2015 or even 13. I can see that, but those were good teams as well. And in fairness to Gonzaga, they kept losing to teams who did go on to the Final Four or even win the national championship. So it is about who you're bracketed with. Maybe it'll pan out for Mark Few this season.
Yeah, I think you touched on a really important point. This college basketball season has been tremendous from the very beginning with some great last-second games and big matchups. I was someone who was saying that St. Mary's was going to beat Gonzaga. They were going to be the ones that trip up Gonzaga. They have the 5 starters returning. They had 25 wins last year. Once Gonzaga got by them, I just sort of wrote it off. But Gonzaga does shoot twos at a very, very high rate. And I think that that's the key to this season. Both teams last year in the final game, UNC and Nova, they shot their twos very well, of course, excluding, the final 2 shots, probably is what everybody remembers. But, who are some teams that sort of lost art of shooting twos, right? Who are some teams that you've come across in your numbers that shoot twos at a high rate that maybe could bode well for the postseason?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned St. Mary's because they're the victims of an unfortunate optical illusion. They basically are as good as everybody thought they would be. It's just they're doing it in the season of this incredible Gonzaga happening. This is one of the better St. Mary's teams of any time. That includes the Dellavedova teams. So they really are all of that. They're experienced. They make their twos, at a nice 56% clip in West Coast Conference play. So don't sleep on the Gales necessarily. I had not to keep recycling the same names, but I wrote last week how Villanova is possibly the best 2-point shooting team ever. It's hard to throw those superlatives around in a season when the entire sport is shooting twos better than they used to. The numbers are up across the board. I do think coaches are getting the message through to kind of stay away from those 2-point jumpers and emphasizing getting all the way to the rim. And that does have a beneficial effect on the percentages we see. But I'm like you. I just feel like that's a nice little security blanket. I like to see an offense that can, do that. If you make threes too, that's a great bonus. So I'm kind of describing the UCLA offense there. And then it's doubly reassuring if then you turn around, as Gonzaga does, and you force misses in the paint. So that doesn't mean that I'm going to pick Gonzaga to win the national championship. I want to see the bracket come out. But those are general tendencies that do feel reassuring in March.
Were you surprised, John, with that bracket preview, which, basketball junkies like us ate up? I was shocked. I did not know that they really give so much emphasis to the location. And I had a friend of mine who's a huge Villanova fan sort of complain and say, okay, because of location and the seating, I believe the bracket was, let's see, they had Villanova, They had Kentucky, Louisville, and UCLA. I mean, the bracket of death. It really does. It almost makes it seem like I don't know if location matters as much in terms of if the other teams below you are going to be in a difficult pod. Maybe a team like Villanova would rather go out west if they had an easier bracket than stay in Madison Square Garden, fight a UCLA team that you wrote about, is prolific on offense. And then, after that battle, they're going to fight the winner of, let's say a Kentucky Louisville, hypothetically, of course. What are your thoughts on that seeding that came out there?
Well, as a coach, you have got no control over that, presently. I've bandied about the idea of more of a bracket draft kind of format where you would have exactly the choice you talk about. Do I want to be a one seed who plays close to home, or if I get a shot in an easier bracket, maybe I'm willing to cross the country? I think those would make for some interesting choices. I think it would make for great live TV if it were kind of a draft format.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, no matter what the coach decides, you would get booed, just like every team at the NBA draft gets booed, no matter what they decide. And I think it would make for a really, really good selection show, basically, although technically it's not a selection show. It would be more of a seeding show. But the NCAA could still, do the S-curve, and then teams would, in that order, pick their spot. I think it would be fun, but short of that, Jay Wright will have to play the bracket that he's handed, and he'll know that there always is a bracket of death that just looks forbidding on the day that it's released. B, it usually doesn't pan out. Somebody loses. And C, what does Villanova care anyway? I mean, they were a 2 seed who had to beat a very good one in the form of Kansas last year. And they did it. Kansas last year is probably better or as good as any team that Villanova can face this year. And maybe that's Jay Wright's bulletin board material: is, hey, we have no fear. Bring on Kentucky, bring on UCLA, and they're pretty good, the Wildcats. So I wouldn't undersell their chances.
We're talking with ESPN insiders John Gasaway today. Let's move on to one of the most polarizing teams, I think, in college basketball is Virginia. Inside, you recently wrote about this on Tuesday Truths. You mentioned UVA's offense is broken. My partner and I have argued about Virginia all year long. He loves their metrics, their defensive efficiency, everything that Virginia is really all about. But my view is this, John. They couldn't get by their green kryptonite, no pun intended, in Michigan State. Then all they have to do is beat number 10 seed in 13 lost Syracuse. They had a 16-point lead, and then they blow that, which is massively un-Virginia-like. And they had a great scorer in Malcolm Brogdon. Now this year, they have Jack Salt, Mariel Shayok, sort of role players, and they have an efficient yet great athlete, not a great athlete rather, in London Perennis. I think they're headed towards an early round upset. What's wrong with Virginia, and can Coach Bennett take it to the shop, tune it up, and spit it out for March Madness?
Yeah, they're playing great defense as always and taking excellent care of the ball, which should matter. But unfortunately, they are really reliant on jumpers. Not that they're necessarily a perimeter-oriented team who shoots a lot of threes, but even when they shoot twos, they don't necessarily get looks at the rim. They're still shooting a jump shot, even though it might be a relatively close-in attempt. And that's a tough way to live. They don't emphasize drives all the way to the 10 at Virginia. That doesn't necessarily matter when you play defense as phenomenally well as they do. But they hit a rough patch, obviously, until they got to the welcoming arms of the NC State defense, and then suddenly they looked like world beaters again on offense. So it is a concern going forward. And Virginia might be a case where, as surprising as this season has been, and as weird as the preseason AP top 25 would look right now, if you took a look at it with teams like Texas and Connecticut and Indiana there, Virginia might be one case where the preseason conventional wisdom was or is slowly turning out to be correct, because I remember self-consciously writing, because I was thinking I was just parroting a Me Too point. Wow, Virginia is going to be good on defense again. They really line up to do well on that side of the ball. but got to worry about losing Brogdon, and they're probably going to take a step back on offense. That basically is what we're looking at statistically the last week of February in ACC play. So maybe in this one instance, and one instance only, maybe we were smarter than we knew back in November.
Yeah, no, definitely. And now let's switch to the West Coast love, specifically a little Pac-12. I know the ACC and Big 12 have been talked up as top conferences in the country. You talked recently about seed points, which I loved, and how that can be used to measure a conference performance. Based off the bracket preview that you saw, the ACC had 12 seed points, the Big 12 had 9, and I think Oregon, UCLA, and Arizona, that trio, I think they all could make the Elite Eight and maybe even further. And so we talk about the Big 12 being the toughest conference in the ACC. In your analysis, where does the Pac-12 rank against those other conferences?
The Pac-12 suffers by comparison because the bottom of the league is not as good. Specifically, if I don't want to embarrass any team, but Oregon State is having a very down year statistically. And the trouble with comparing conferences head to head, one, they're different sizes, and two, if you're bothering to compare conferences, obviously they're good. So, I mean, nobody says, well, let's, talk about the MEAC versus the Sun Belt. I mean, if you're talking Pac-12, obviously they're good, but the tops of good conferences tend to run to a type. It's like Tolstoy's line about families. But but the bottoms of conferences, those can be. The bottom of the Big 12 is just incredible. I mean, if Texas is your worst team, and they're whatever they are, number 70 or 75 in the country, I mean, that's probably the best last place team in a long time.
Good point.
The Pac-12 cannot make that claim. I mean, Oregon State is really, really bad. And, that's 1/12 of the conference. That does hit your bottom line statistically. So nobody's, saying the Pac-12 is the best conference in the country or best top to bottom. It's just that we're not used to seeing 3 Pac-12 teams. In fact, you bring up seed points, which is just you get 4 points for a 1 and 1 for a 4 and everything in between. The Pac-12 has a shot at their best seeding performance that way in 15, 16 years, the last time I looked at it. So that's how good these top 3 are, speaking, of course, of Oregon, Arizona, and UCLA. They're good, even though they play in the same league as Oregon State. And I agree with you. They're all threats to go deep into the tournament. I still feel like people aren't getting a correct handle on Oregon and specifically the defense they played or playing current tense. People don't just look at a body like Boucher's and think, wow, he's a tough defensive dude. But look what happens to the ball when you attempt a shot against him, and you'll understand. This is a really tough defense, and oh, by the way, they score well too. So don't sleep on Dana Altman's guys.
Another team, John, West Virginia, very divisive here on our podcast. I call them the Ben Roethlisberger of college basketball because I feel like when they're home, they're significantly better than when they're on the road. Of course, unless you're from Oklahoma, because the Sooners and Cowboys have no trouble winning in West Virginia. The big thing is the turnover rate. Is that a measure that we should really pay attention to? How does turnover rate, in your experience, correlate to the tournament, if at all?
Well, a couple things about West Virginia. Yes, they force turnovers. So what I want to look at is what do they do when they don't? And even in a world where there were no turnovers, or I don't know, where everybody had the same turnover rate, it's the same thing. They would still be better than their opponents. It's true they wouldn't be as much better as their opponents as they are because they've got a really healthy turnover margin. But this is a basically sound defense, even when they don't get a turnover out of you. Opponents are missing a healthy, although not outrageous, number of 2s against them in Big 12 play. And I guess the other point I would make about the Mountaineers would be the obvious, counterfactual. What if they failed to collapse at Kansas? What if they really did win that game? How different would your attitude be? Even if they just won it by 1 point after collapsing in the last 4 minutes, would you feel dramatically different about a team that won at Allen Fieldhouse? Maybe a little bit. And in effect, they very nearly did pull that off, which Iowa State had just done previous to them. So I doubt that I'll be picking West Virginia to win it all. But, possession for possession, this does rate out as a really good Big 12 team, the best one in the Big 12. They've got some funky close losses and some weird scoring margins and big wins. So I don't necessarily think that's the end all and be all, but they're certainly up there on the same bleachers as Kansas, even though they won't get the same seed as the Jayhawks.
And you're right, winning at Fog Island can jumpstart you. Look at Iowa State and how hot they are right now. All right, gosh, John, we could talk forever. Last question, then I'll get you out of here. Appreciate it. Small schools, teams like the Wichita States of the world. The Shockers are 27-4 right now and 17-1 in Missouri in the Missouri Valley Conference. They really haven't beaten a big-name team all year, unless you count, and I love how you referred to this, was it the best-worst team in the country in Oklahoma? Something like that. If the Shockers don't win the Missouri Valley, I personally would want them to get in the tournament because I hate seeing dominance like at Wichita State miss out on the tournament for a 7-9 big conference team getting in over them. I'm not talking, about a team that's 25-10 or something and loses in the semifinals. But if Wichita State with a huge season, dominance in their conference, and the only loss really, right, was the road loss at Illinois State, which isn't terrible. No one wants to play them. Do they get in your mind in the conference finals if they lose and to the NCAA tournament? And what are your thoughts on the dominance of the small schools that maybe stumble in the conference tournament?
Well, there is a precedent in play here, and that's called Wichita State last year. They had a worse record than they're going to have on Selection Sunday. They were only 24-8. They did lose in the semis of the Missouri Valley tournament, and it was funny because they were just as beloved of laptops last year as they are this year, and for reasons that don't necessarily apply currently. I was gearing up to say, no, be careful, watch out, don't believe the laptops on Wichita State. Mm-hmm. And the conversation quickly swung around to, they don't even deserve to get in, and I had to backpedal furiously and go, no, wait, I don't mean that. Let's not get carried away. Don't listen to John Gasaway that much.
There you go. That's when you're like E.F. Hutton. When you talk, we all listen. That's it.
Clearly, they deserve to get in. You're misunderstanding me. So I do think they're safely in, even short of an automatic bid. But it's a fair question. I mean, they're whomping the heck out of the Missouri Valley all season long, and the Valley is interesting because they've got Illinois State and really no other team that you can measure off of and say, yeah, this is believable. We trust this. So I've outlined some reasons where I'm slightly leery of a team in Wichita State's position, not necessarily the Shockers in 2017 per se. And one thing that does get at me year after year is that the Missouri Valley as a conference does not try for offensive rebounds. So a team in the Shockers position, and this is not, their doing or their fault, there's nothing they can do about it. They're going to look a little better than I think they otherwise would, specifically on defense, because the other team is there saying, here, please take this rebound. And nobody ever, it doesn't have to be in North Carolina even, but just like a normal team who says, yeah, we're going to go for this. We're going to try for this offensive rebound. I mean, sometimes they will get those. They'll get putbacks, and that'll hit your bottom line. So I don't suppose that, Wichita State is really going to shut down opposing offenses, when they get to the tournament. But, clearly this is an NCAA tournament caliber team that any major conference higher seed is going to have to take very seriously. And if you guys haven't been watching Wichita State, my gosh, just in the game yesterday where Missouri State hung around, and it was at Springfield, Missouri, Landry Shamet is just growing by game as a freshman, and it's like Fred Van Hoo. I mean, this guy funny. This guy is just draining threes. So I mean, if you could play defense and hit the long ball, watch out. Wichita State is going to be fun to watch.
Wow. Well, John Gasaway, we can't thank you enough for a few moments here. Folks, if you're not reading him and following him at ESPN Insider, you're just making a mistake. Great college basketball mind. You can find him on Twitter at John Gasaway. He's on ESPN Insider. He has his own blog, johngasaway.com, where he breaks down so many great stats and really looks at these teams through an analytical and critical eye. John, thank you so much for a few moments. We're thrilled to have you on, and I'm sure you join us in the anticipation of what I think is going to be a phenomenal March Madness NCAA tournament.
Absolutely. Can't wait to tip it off, and thank you for having me. It was fun.
Anytime. Thanks, John.